Oh, Hana, hey. Oh, Hana, hey.
This is the third year that URBC has happened, and this is an amazing community because of our interdisciplinary lens and tackle challenging issues in a collaborative way, knowing that we cannot plan adequately in silos. And so we're bringing people together to try to plan across silos, try to plan across sectors, and truly build resilience.
We start with baseline scenarios. We develop what-if planning scenarios. And then we engage with our partners to look at what a disaster resilience strategy might look like, and more importantly, how it fits into existing planning and policy development. These are big challenges. And looking out your window today, it can be overwhelming at times. And I want to thank the UC Natural Hazards Center for bringing forward the contributions of Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone, who in their symposium introduced us to the idea of active hope, which is really a process. It's making a commitment to find and contribute our very best responses to a world that in which disaster risk and the promises of sustainability seem to be becoming increasingly elusive. So while it's overwhelming, there's a lot of opportunity for us to pause, take stock of where we are, and most importantly, think about where we want to be. And active hope is really that process of it's a three-stage process. It starts with understanding the situation and where we are in the process of these evolving disasters in Western British Columbia. It moves to then a very design-based process of identifying what we hope for and the actions that will lead toward a more desirable future. And in the context of our work here today, that's really thinking about what recovery for us might look like, envisioning what that recovery path might look like. And then from that, doing the hard work to really think about the targets and goals that we might want to lay out to help us navigate a path toward that desired future.
Flashing forward again, we continue to add people to our floodplain, up into almost 1 million people in 2000. And here we sit approximately today in 2015 with 1.2 million people currently exposed to riverine hazard only. We're not talking about coastal hazards from tsunami or the chronic stress of sea level rise. This is just the riverine picture at a very, very high level. But I think it tells a really important story that we have a scenario right now, and in part because we have chosen the pathway of protection and defend that has made us feel safe. And therefore, we've put a lot of people in the floodplains who are now at risk. And it's something that I think we should be cognizant of as we move forward. And ideally not change our pathway moving forward. BC is also at the forefront of doing some really interesting work to try and build more holistic pictures of risk, to try and weave in a lot of these intangible ideas, especially some of the storytelling and Indigenous ways of knowing and being into the more Western science and the quantitative methods that we're using. And so working with the leadership of the Silk people and the Okanagan Nation Alliance, I think there's some really sort of interesting ways to try and draw in all of these ideas into integrated risk assessments that are sort of become more meaningful.
The thing about collaboration is that it's difficult. It takes more time. And Susanna, as an engagement specialist, can attest, it's definitely tricky, but it's so important in this day and age. And I think both Murray's and Tamsin's presentations also allude to this need to collaborate. And we hear about it all the time. And the innovation piece for me has been a critical theme as well. As we face this era of non-stationarity and rapid change, innovation happens in a space where we aren't afraid to be wrong, or where we aren't afraid to learn from mistakes that we make. We really try and create a space of dialogue through URBC. And I think that is in the spirit of fostering innovation, recognizing a diversity of voices, different types of knowledge, It's hard to have a lot of expert knowledge in this day and age where change is so rapid, and the work we need to do is quite is quite big. The work that we need to do to address these risks and build resilience. So the UR effort is really about creating this community conversation and focusing on dialogue.
It also really brings me to the point of what's the role of a region. And the first point I think is really around what I would say is that recognizing that resilience is a collective action problem. And I'm actually going to weave together two things at this point. One is really our region's response to the COVID pandemic, and also the insights that I've gained in working on the Hayward scenario and reflecting on these past 30 years of activity in the Bay Area. And that brings me to my third value, which I think is about data. The data that Murray and others have presented just now. This is so crucial for policymaking. And so often that really does need to be developed at a regional level. You can't get a good perspective of the hazard and the extreme risks that are posed without looking at that regional view when we're in these large metropolitan areas. So tools such as scenarios, I think, are really important. I think also having institutions nested in the Bay, in your region, like we have in the Bay Area. We've had the benefit of having the U.S. Geologic Survey have a Western office here. We had the Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center housed at UC Berkeley, but a consortium of many universities here for years. All of these things really help, and we need to also do in the Bay Area more work around doing collaborative regional building inventory development work and other things that you're working on as well in Vancouver. If we're focused in our one area of interest in being a specialist and expert on earthquake risk or flood risk, we have to recognize that we've got to come together and think globally, but act locally. And it's never been more true that we need to really embrace the systemic interdependencies, the connectedness, and the identity as regions, because these problems are really bigger than individual communities can handle on their own. And the more resourceful communities really need to help bring along those entities with smaller staffs, sometimes less technical know-how and funding. And as technical professionals, we need to work together with community organizations and vice versa to really understand risk and build our collective resilience together.
We know that in the future, in 2030, over 70% of the buildings that will exist then have already been built, and many before modern standards. So we have some work to do in addressing the existing building stock. So our Alterations to Existing Buildings project aims, it's a mandate under Clean BC for BSSB to adopt and the government to adopt a code for alterations to existing buildings by 2024 that addresses water or energy consumption buildings.
So we've heard a bit about the BC regulatory context and how all of that kind of works. And then we're hearing from Kylie about how we can think about specific programs that target things that we want to do. So existing buildings, how do we make a retrofit actually happen? Where I come in and my presentation comes in today is I work for the city of Vancouver. I'm an urban planner, and I'm trying to develop a policy program that means to reduce the risk to our 90,000 existing buildings, those that are privately held. What we have to do in order to get all of this done that you see on the screen is build a building inventory, develop a specific and comprehensive assessment of our risks. It's not just enough to know that URM buildings always fall down in earthquakes. We need to know about our URMs, how they're used, where they are, where's the concentration of them, how does that work for the British Columbia context, as Andrew was talking about, our unique regulatory context here in Canada and in British Columbia. So we know that between a third and half of Vancouver residents will be disrupted or displaced for a pretty serious amount of time, a few months, in a very major earthquake. We know that a massive earthquake is likely to cause hundreds of severe casualties and injuries. We know that building damage at a really high level is concentrated in just 10% of our city buildings. It isn't every single little building takes a little bit of the hurt, or every single building is at fault in every single way. It's that there are certain types of buildings where we really start to see that concentration.
One of the challenges with the code is kind of the responsiveness to evolving conditions. And in fact, even the seismic standards are evolving in 2010 National Building Code, there was a certain set of assumptions with respect to the seismic risk. And then in 2015, when the revised code nationally was published, those assumptions changed such that the strength of buildings needed to increase dramatically. Design ground motion. In other words, how strong of an event, a seismic event in my location, do I need to design my building to withstand? And in 2020, those standards are going to change once again.
So the province of BC commissioned a cost of adaptation report, and that was released in December of 2012. And that estimated a price tag of almost $10 billion to deal with a meter of sea level rise, largely raising and widening sea dikes. And so a number of the flood practitioners and decision makers we work with felt, well, it's a bit jaw-dropping, and so let's take a proactive planning approach, a longer-term planning horizon to try to get ahead of this, amortize the costs over time, and think through how we're going to deal with not only current flood hazards, but future flood hazards as a result of climate change. We, after consulting with partners and confirming there was interest and support for this, we started small with an initial phase focusing on improving our knowledge base around flood hazards, flood vulnerability, and flood management. Then that really made a compelling case to focus on this strategy. What we found was flood hazards are expected to increase as a result of climate change. We have tens of billions of dollars potentially exposed that would have really significant economic and other consequences if a large flood occurred in the region. And the existing diking system doesn't offer the level of protection that we previously thought. So we entered into phase 2, which is actually building the strategy. And this is involved undertaking a number of technical analyses projects and very significant engagement and dialogue. And we're working towards a strategy for next spring and then moving towards an implementation phase.
And to be able to use a regional lens in the flood management strategy and help decision makers prioritize areas for risk reduction, we need to first understand where the flood risk areas are. Each jurisdiction, be it First Nation, local governments, or sector-specific groups will have their own priorities related to local needs and interests. And I know that some communities have already done their own flood risk assessments and prioritization. But we know that as a region, flood impacts in one area can affect other areas, including those outside the floodplain, for example, through disrupted services or a flooded highway. And we also know that we have limited resources and need to make sure that our actions, policies, and investments are targeted and strategic. And so a regional flood risk profile can help us see where and how local communities are connected, and also where potential high priority areas are. As part of the technical work to develop the strategy, the Fraser Basin Council oversaw the development of a hydraulic model and associated mapping for the Lower Fraser River. And this helped us understand where the hazards are, so where and how deep floodwaters would go under various scenarios. So as an example, this is the mapping for a 50-year or 2% AEP flood, and this is the 500-year Fraser River flood. And just a note that the model illustrates where dikes would be overtopped, but it doesn't show dike failures, which could happen before a dike is overtopped. And this has been a very useful tool for engaging on the strategy and also for strategy partners to work on their own projects. But it doesn't provide information about where and what types of impacts would occur.
In putting together this session, we talked about being, honest. I think Metro Vancouver does a really good job of it in terms of what Metro is capable of doing, right? Like, what does Metro actually have authority to regulate or manage, and where does Metro play that convening role versus, what are the elements that are still a challenge for Metro? And I think we consistently hear, land use planning is still a challenge, right? Because it's through consensus in Metro. So, and I think this has also come up in terms of the regional flood strategy, where the Fraser Basin Council is doing an amazing job. They're able to, push forward on the risk assessment, the regional risk assessment, for example. they're able to push some of those pieces along, but they also get criticized at the end of the day for not having that kind of regulatory authority to make certain things happen. So I think looking at, you need that governance map. I think going back to Tamsin's point, which she was making more in relation to data, but it applies across policy and action as well, which is understanding, who's able to push in which spaces, and then, where are the kind of remaining gaps.
I think one of the challenges that we see here is that in some cases, data at the regional scale is produced on somewhat of an ad hoc basis. In some cases, we have data for some hazards and not others. And in some cases, we have data at local scales versus regional scales versus broader scales. And so it makes it challenging when we're trying to interpret that data and consider that data in terms of developing policy.
Within Metro Vancouver, even our jurisdictions have different levels of resources. And so whether it's a small municipality or some of the in-region First Nations or, are quite different than the city of Vancouver or city of Surrey. When we're talking about some big risk events, whether it's climate change or earthquake, I think being able to have the tools necessary to distribute resources as needed, both in pre and planning for those events and also post events is still a bit of a challenge with the tools that we have.
That's exactly something that we've identified thus far, is that it seems to be in some cases a bit of a patchwork of data sets that we're trying to pull together cohesively here at the regional scale. But in some cases it might be helpful if we're sort of all working from the same playbook. And I think that's another piece to this puzzle is sort of, how can we ensure that we're all working with the most up-to-date data at the right scale, to be used the correct way.
My experience with working at a local municipality in this region was kind of came to a head around interface fires and the premium that homeowners pay to be adjacent to wooded areas, to have views. And if you're proposing anything that improves safety or reduces risk from wildfires in that area, it is met with public resistance because of those reasons, that they paid a premium to have that nice wooded area adjacent to them, or they paid a premium to have a certain view. And when you're making changes, it's often met with resistance, and then of course that ends up in the political arena. So I think this goes back to the earlier conversation about people really understanding what the benefits and risks are of these different elements.
One of the things I think, at least in the climate space, that we are always, we're challenged with is translating climate data, climate science data, and information into useful forms for the decision makers that are making other types of decisions. So one example is translating climate data into rainfall projections for engineers who do designing of infrastructure. So that's some work that we've done at the University of Waterloo has done to translate, take those climate projections that are useful for understanding at a high level what the climate change, how it will change, but then helping our engineers figure out how we're going to design the pipes and the drainage systems and other things into, and so I think that's probably one example, but I think there are probably other ways that this data needs to be and information needs to be translated into something that's useful to either engineers, but also our political decision makers, so they can really understand what the implications of one decision or another is when they're making policy decisions.
Important part of this conversation is this whole idea around policy targets. They exist for disaster risk reduction. And I think there's an opportunity for us as a region to come together to start articulating what might be some targets that the region might set for itself for risk reduction that local authorities could take on as part of their growth management, their land use planning, just like we do for other areas, whether it's climate change or other dimensions of sustainable land use planning. We have these frameworks in place that we use. And it seems to me like we can and ought to be doing that for disaster resilience planning as well. And the Sendai framework, offers at least some high-level policy goals, and the targets are actually pretty clear in terms of things that we can do that would increase resilience and promote more social equity in terms of who bears the consequence of that risk. And I think we actually have probably a better opportunity in this region than anywhere else to implement the intent of Sendai at a regional scale and build it into the regional planning context. So I think that's what I would urge, is that we start thinking about disaster resilience targets. And our experience has been, if we're only bringing risk information forward, it's always received as a message of liability. It's seen as a way to prevent growth and the opportunities that come with growth and development. And what we have learned is that if we present risk information not as the negative consequences, but as a starting point to look at, where are there opportunities to reduce risk, it changes the conversation with local authorities, with chief administrative officers, because then they can see what's in their authority to take action on. They can see very clearly where the opportunities are and how they can build them into their planning process.
The imperative behind this is to really think how we can get better performance out of our buildings, how we can get better performance out of our communities following a disaster. Obviously, disasters are in the front of our minds with this group. They're in the front of the minds of everybody in this year, particularly as we're in the midst of 1 to 2 to 3 of them, depending on what day it is. So this standard, this functional recovery standard, it's a way of thinking through buildings. It's a way of thinking through the concept of resilience and what that means at the building scale, the community scale, and helps us think about what it is that we're actually able to get out of our buildings.
The point we want to make here is that we follow our traditional design path. We're actually designing for safety. Everybody got that answer right. And what that means is it's going to be hard to reach resilience if that's all we do. If we want to get closer to designing for resilience, we got to be thinking more in our design about reoccupancy time and functional recovery time.
As we plan and design new hospitals, which are defined as critical infrastructure, and long-term care facilities, we need to go beyond the stringent post-disaster requirements that already apply to in terms of system reliability, future capacity, and redundancy. We need to go beyond what we are required to do in order to plan and design for our new climate reality.
So there's a lot of these cartoons on sort of this continuum of performance. I just want to say, here's our IE of 1, the normal buildings by the current code, 2%, 2.5% drift. And the reason I'm showing this continuum, because in the code, we've got over 40 different structural systems that are acceptable to design to meet this criteria. And the performance of each one of them is different, but it's definitely going to be better than collapse prevention, and it's going to achieve life safety. Again, for the next level of buildings, of the high importance ones, the bar moves to the left. So we're getting better performance as we move down and reduce drift. As we move to the post-disaster building, the bar moves to the left. And again, the beauty here is we've only got about 20 structural systems that can be used, so the variation becomes a bit better. Again, in the current code, we have provisions for design, base isolation, and dampers. That's brand new in the current code that we have. And the goal here, it states in the code that all structural components shall remain elastic for the 1 in 2475 earthquake. So for these, the bar is over here right now. What can we do? Again, right now we can take conventional design and we can get to this point. Again, base isolation dampers there, we can get to this point. Based on the studies that I've been involved in, this is 1 to 5% of the total building cost as the incremental cost to get here. And again, as structural engineers, we can design every building to get here, but this is something to keep in mind.
We're developing for UBC what we call a roadmap to resilience that consists of a few different guidance documents. The first is what we call a seismic real estate framework that guides decision making. And that's underpinned by a couple different resilience-based design guidelines, one for new construction and one for retrofits and renewals. And then just digging a bit deeper on each of these, the real estate framework really defines tolerable risk targets for various building types on campus, and we've designated the buildings on campus as critical, important, or normal. We're trying to basically understand from the current risks, what are the gap, or what is the gap between the current risks and the resilience objectives that I showed on the first slide, and then how do we close that gap? So really, this is trying to fill, the decision making to get to a goal of those campus resilience vision by 2050, roughly.
That's not different from the California experience. It's just that California has had more earthquakes, and it takes 2 or 3 before people finally realize we're going to need to do something about these unreinforced masonry buildings. In Iran, they had they talk about it as the first earthquake gets the attention of the researchers, the second gets the attention of the people, the third gets the attention of the government. So until you get to that point, it's a challenge. I'm not saying it's easy. And in fact, we don't have to look just to California as a counterpoint to what you're seeing in BC. In Seattle and Portland, they tried to get URM, unreinforced masonry retrofit ordinances in the last couple of years, and both of those failed. So we know that it's a challenge, and sometimes, sadly, what you need is a tragedy to get things happening. Hopefully, with good leadership, we avoid that. To go back to the sweet spot question or the funding question, yes, it's easy to think that there might be some solution that if we just found it, everybody would do it. That's not the way it works. If that were true, we'd have everybody doing it. Well, what I think is the better way, or the more accurate way to look at this, is that there are leaders and there are followers. And leaders, I'm talking about jurisdictions, clients and developers, engineers. They're already doing this stuff, and they are showing us proof of concept that it can be cost effective. The project delivery system that Angie described has actually been used in University of California, San Francisco. Same thing. They put out the RFP. Here's our minimum. Do the best you can. This is our budget. We're not going a penny over. And they got an outstanding building for 0% cost premium because they understood that that's what they wanted, how they wanted to do it. So you let the leaders lead. They're going to show us that proof of concept. I don't think it's about trying to find a pile of money first.
Understanding clearly what's the cost of an action. And not just in terms of our assets and infrastructure, but our ability to provide services out in the community and beyond our sphere of control, and even beyond our sphere of influence. And so that includes community health and human health. So quantifying that and conveying the cost to our broader society of inaction, I think, is extremely important. And secondly is to redefine ourselves. What is our business as usual, and reset our baseline. So in collaboration with all the regional health authorities in BC, Intrepid, professional services firms, and public sector organizations, including BC Housing and UBC, we're working to do just that.
We know that people are receptive to the ideas, but we also know that they need a pretty strong value proposition to take action. And because of that, and because of the inaction, we know that our risk trends are continuing to increase, and it's a hard curve to flatten. So we look for miracles, and we don't have a solution, a miracle solution for you, but we are focusing on the opportunities that risk information bring to the table. It's a base of evidence that's represented by very high resolution urban risk and recovery models. They don't address all of our questions, but they are starting to address more than we had before. And we think they bring to the table a really important base of evidence to both inform, but also to empower actions that we could take. We bring to the table indicators that measure impacts to the built environment. But what's new and we think innovative is we also bring to the table a range of indicators that look at and measure the strain on social fabric. So this is new. What's also new is we're bringing these two threads of modeling into the frame of functional recovery. So we're not only just looking at the immediate impacts and consequences, but we're asking the question, how do these impacts and consequences translate into recovery profiles at the neighborhood level? We measure building damage and downtime and how those impacts are distributed across the built environment. what's driving those damaged hotspots. We look at the implications for critical injury and entrapment immediately following an earthquake, and again, which building types are likely to be the hotspots of concern. We look at how the damage translates into economic losses and where those losses are concentrated in our built environment.
One thing I want to talk about here is there's been a shift from critical infrastructure, and it's still being called critical infrastructure, to more critical functions. And by function, we mean the ability to deliver a specified output. And that can be goods, services, information, and decisions or whatever. And critical functions are critical infrastructure functions, or those functions that deliver goods, services, and information that we deem to be essential for society. In that regard, we measure not whether something's on or off, but the availability or percentage degradation. So there's two examples there: food stores and let's say a hospital, and there's maybe around 1,200 food stores in the region, and in this particular hospital, that's 260 beds. Well, after the disaster, we may find that the functionality has been decreased and that only just over 300 food stores are operating, not just because they're physically damaged, but for various reasons, which I'll get into, and that the hospital might only be able to support something like 80 beds.
The monitoring that needs to be happening and showing the results for Sendai, it happened at the global level. So even though some hazards such as earthquake are not frequent for the 15 period of time, are not frequent enough to manifest their impact basically, because the monitoring would happen at global level, we will be able to see how as a global community we are progressing in reducing risk. The risk modeling and risk estimate methodologies come to play that can help us to not only anticipate what kind of impacts we may have in a community, but also model how different risk management strategies and policies can reduce that risk. At the time, the idea was there in the group at UN for designing the monitoring mechanism. But the second reason that they decided not to use modeling is because of lack of capacity in a lot of developing countries in conducting risk modeling. I'm also taking this opportunity to share another aspect of Sendai. One of the main shifts that Sendai brought forward compared to the previous framework, the Hyogo framework for risk reduction, was to shift from only focusing on emergency and disaster management, shift to focus on disaster risk management. As a result, there are three components to that. One is to prevent creation of new risk, making sure our new development, new buildings and new hospitals and roads and bridges are not built in hazard-prone zones, are not built with vulnerable designs. The second pillar is reducing existing risk. So because of our past construction, because of our past construction of our assets, the assets we have and wherever they're located, there is certain level of risk that there are measures, structural and non-structural measures that we can use to reduce those risks. And at last, again, managing residual risk through emergency preparedness, recovery, and build back better planning. And all of those need to be informed by risk information.
You know, this symposium is all about understanding risk, which is clearly a critical first step in disaster risk management. You know, emergency management regulation, the regulation we have for the province under our Emergency Program Act, identifies 18 specific hazard groups in BC, and covering up to, depending how you add it, 52 specific hazards. And I think it's also a really good testament to the need to apply rigor and objectivity to our risk assessment to inform evidence-based decision-making.
Starts to speak to the different components of the national risk profile. The first being governance. So we did stand up a robust governance within the federal family. We'll be leaning on our existing governance frameworks at the federal, provincial, territorial level. And we will also be looking at ways to engage whole of society, including working with Indigenous communities. The second big bucket of the work is engagement. So it is about how do we work in lockstep with all different stakeholders. And the third one is data and online tools. This is about evidence based decision making. It's about building data and our knowledge. We will tell you that for emergency management in Canada, data is something I think we are all grasping with. And we're also working in close collaboration with our other strategic allies, looking at what other countries have done in this domain. And ultimately, what we're trying to do as far as outcomes, it is about improving the understanding of our capabilities. So what are our current set of capabilities, but also what are our gaps? And those should be informed by assessments so that we can then look at shared investments in building our capabilities. The second one is about improving risk awareness, not only for governments at all levels, but also about the Canadian citizen, so that each individual can be informed of what are their risk exposure so that they can make the right decision. And lastly, it is about evidence-informed decision-making with data, with assessments, and with kind of that continual loop that is so important.
As part of the emergency management strategy, funding, NRCan is implementing an earthquake early warning system to alert people and critical infrastructure operators located in areas of high seismic risk of an imminent earthquake to enable precautionary actions to be taken. This is a real game changer moving forward. It'll move from the current system to offer seconds to a minute of advance warning of a seismic event, which will provide hopefully sufficient time for preventative measures to be taken, including things like opening doors at fire and ambulance stations, delaying landings for aircraft during an event, stopping bridge and tunnel traffics, and halting surgical and other kinds of procedures in advance of a big event.
Our team has developed this kind of foundational human settlement layer for Canada that brings in Earth observation data, looking at where people are, what hazards and risks they might be exposed to, what the social fabric, what are the demographics, what are the socio-demographics of people in various places, and what are the capacity of those people as well. And then looking at engineering data on the built environment. So what do we know about the vulnerability and susceptibility of different types of buildings that can lead to different impacts on those buildings?
A new project we've just started to undertake under the emergency management strategy is to develop what's called the National Flood Hazard Data Layer. Again, key to helping inform the national risk profile and giving a national picture of flood hazard based on existing authoritative flood hazard maps. So we're in the process of putting together a puzzle, if you will, from the different jurisdictions, local maps, local flood hazard maps, and building sort of like a common schema or a common structure in which we can maintain and update this data and have, sort of one picture from all these different maps that are being collected. And this is going to be maintained in a national database. And this project is currently underway, where the current deliverable this month will be an update on the status of state of play of flood mapping in Canada in the various provinces and territories.
I'd like to just share that for a lot of us as Indigenous people, our spirituality is our way of life, and that we were, a lot of us, taught by our grandparents. And we carry that responsibility and obligation to carry on the teachings that they shared with us, because we don't own it. And they didn't own it. And it just keeps going through as part of the legacy of the footsteps that we walk in. And so my grandfather, as part of my welcome to you, I'd like to say that we need to, in Squamish, we say, in Chomot and Squalwin. In Hamalkamalin, we say, Natsamot and Squalwin. One heart and one mind this afternoon. And to be able to, and as my late grandfather Sequan taught me, to chench and dwight, stand and work together to hold each other up, support one another, help each other with what we're going to be sharing today, with our transfer of knowledge and with what we take away in our hearts and minds.
Thank you so much for setting us up in a good way, and also for modeling the exact thing we're trying to do in this session, is to remind us how to create space for being present and connected to our land, to our ancestors, to the work we're doing, and to each other, to support each other in this way. It is so important. This session is for people who are working in disaster-related fields that are dealing with natural hazards, that it is a very stressful and challenging role to play. To stare down the eventuality of a difficult moment because of natural disasters and human-made climate change, or for just preparing for it. There's a lot of weight that practitioners and planners and researchers carry.
As a practitioner of emergency management, my shift over to FNHA has really been grounded in a space of wellness and a space of culture. And it's really allowed me to think about what my own personal and professional space looks like by embracing that and actually having wellness, both spiritual, cultural, and physical wellness, as a part of how I move through my work professionally. And it's been a noticeable shift for me in terms of how I recover personally through really adverse events and circumstances in my day-to-day work, as well as in my professional space. So as opposed to having another technical discussion on First Nations emergency management or how we build resilience, what I thought I would do with this time was share the gifts of how resilience can be grounded through a space of wellness.
So as something I always like to do when I bring people together is to make some time to offer some agreements for how we would like to support each other in our time together. And this really aligns with the neuroscience and how our brains work. When we give feedback in a way that is strength-based, it activates the neurons in our prefrontal cortex, puts us in our planning, thinking, compassionate brain, versus when we give feedback in a way that feels threatening, like perhaps, Sally's being called out for being a racist, that activates the neurons in our amygdala. So the behavior response we get is fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and not the desired behavior change that we're hoping for.
It is fundamentally most important that you become the best human being that you can be, and understanding that everything is connected, everything is has a ripple effect. And so when there is a focus or an imbalance in one area, it'll have an imbalance in other areas. Looking at how the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual elements are beyond that is similar to what you will see across different nations and across Turtle Island, is the 4 circles in terms of the medicine wheel and those elements, and the community that you're connected to and holds it together. And what I really like about this piece is, if you see on the outside of the circle, it kind of has these brushed strokes. So it's not a solid picture. It's not like this is what wellness is. It's really important to understand that it's very difficult to be prescriptive in saying what wellness is, because what that reflects back to me, it's meant to capture something that's fluid, something that's always moving. Our wellness is always moving during your stages of life.
We spend a lot of time on the road, and I feel, before I was placed in this position as the coordinator, I was in RHSW, and in the short time that I've been here, I've learned a lot from the elders that we travel with. Levi Martin is here with us today, and he is one of the elders that leads the process when we go into community, and by cedar brushing and by using various forms of medicine with the people that we encounter, and to see people who are completely fatigued and just not in a good space when they arrive to meet our team, and then to see the transformation for the individuals after they've received the help from our cultural support. It's just phenomenal. And, you know, I feel so honored to be able to be a part of that process and to be learning each and every day from the elders that not only I coordinate, but I work alongside with.
Ever since I was when I was a little kid, my father taught me a prayer. When I first wake up, the very first thing I do, I say this prayer, and it says, Danas ia pisal hawit mis hawet. I say that prayer 4 times. Tanas ia pisal hawit mis hawet. Tanas ia pisal hawit mis hawet. Tanas ia pisal hawit mis hawet. And that prayer says, let all good things just naturally drift towards me. After I've said that prayer 4 times, then I open myself to receive the gifts that I need just for today, so that I can do things in a good way.
We know that after an earthquake, it can take hours or days to understand the extent of the damage. You know, you might have all noticed this before when an earthquake happens, and, you know, maybe we go to news or to Twitter or other social media to learn about the impact of these earthquakes. So we know that it takes time to figure out who's been impacted. That's also why a lot of the numbers will change in that first week when we're hearing about the earthquake. So it's hard to know what has happened, but we also know that it's kind of the most critical time where if we have collapsed or partially collapsed buildings, that we need to get to those people quickly, both because they may have injuries that need to be seen to rapidly to save their lives, and also because we know that the aftershocks will continue, and they'll happen most frequently at the beginning, which means that these buildings, which may have partially collapsed or been severely damaged, are likely to experience further shaking when they're already weakened. So what you could expect from this tool once it's operational is that within about 60 minutes after a major event, you would have estimates of the critical injuries and entrapments, entrapment being someone who's stuck in a collapsed or partially collapsed building. And right now, what we're suggesting we would share with people is that we'd have that information by the census dissemination area. So that's just a census geometry that roughly corresponds to a postal code size. We could look at the economic impact by municipality. So each city probably needs to know, how serious is this event? Is this, 0.2% of our GDP within our municipality, or is it 20%? We also would like to give some information about the mass care needs. So when we say mass care, we're talking about people who need shelter, food, water, toilets, so people who are going to be displaced from their homes. And we can view that by the municipality or the neighborhood, depending on where the resources are and how we may need to share them in a kind of mutual aid situation. We can look at the hospital demand by neighborhood. So those are people who need more than first aid, but who we expect that if we can get them to a hospital, that we can save lives. And then finally, we can take a look at some of the debris generation. So if we know that there will be major debris generated along some of our main road corridors, then we could give some information maybe to first responders about which routes they may need to avoid.
So BC SIMS started with a strong ground motion network. Geological Survey of Canada currently maintains an acceleration network of 120 strong motion stations across BC. Ministry of Transportation has contributed that network with 14 new stations, bringing the total number up to 160. So basically, we are using ground motion prediction equations of Boer and Atkinson 2008 to create these shape maps, and we use VS30 values that were preset for certain locations over a region to calculate amplifications. The sensors are currently calculating PGA, PGV, PGD, and KSI, and 2 spectral accelerations at the location of the sensors, and that's how we interpolate those strong motion data over a region.
What we've got here is a system that we've called Model Factory, and we use it routinely, as Tegan was saying, to transform the earthquake risk scenario outputs that we're calculating on a regular basis. And we do a little bit of data massaging and to bring that into a format that's digestible on the other end. So this is something that we use routinely in our earthquake risk calculations, but we think it's applicable to kind of a real-time scenario. So at its core, what it is a bunch of SQL, Python scripts, all wrapping around a PostGIS spatial database. And in a real-time scenario, what we want to do is trigger it automatically with some cloud infrastructure that would be listening to the GitHub repo. So you have your seismologist on call, they calculate the raw OpenQuake outputs, they push it up to a GitHub repo, and that kicks off the process of Model Factory running.
After Drew's Model Factory piece does all of its work, what happens is that the data gets pushed to an application programming interface, or for developers quite familiar with the concept of an API. And so this API, really the intention is to allow developers access to near real-time data using best practices. So we've got a number of international and national standards that we need to comply with when we provide web services to the public. So we will comply with those. We're building this all to the extent possible with sort of cloud native infrastructure pieces. So the intent there is just to make an architecture that's highly scalable and can meet, as of yet unknown demand.
So our approach has been to create one place or platform to access all mapping information to support situational awareness needs for provincial agencies, but also external stakeholders. The COP, or Common Operating Picture Portal, is envisioned to be a one-stop shop, and it includes various self-serve tools to provide a number of services to meet needs of a wide range of stakeholders for multiple hazards, whether it is flooding, fires, landslides, earthquakes, so on and so forth. First and foremost, it includes curated data that already exists, and there are a few examples here on this slide. And the idea here is to take the data and add some value by providing some context and interpretation on how to use it, not only at a provincial scale, but also at a local and regional scale. We also have included several tools that could help analyze some of the data to answer specific questions. For example, when it comes to flooding, what the water level, if the water level was to rise to a certain point during flooding, how many number of buildings would be damaged, and what would be the estimated costs, economic loss and cost within a community. Users are able to develop planning scenarios to better understand the impacts of hazards, and this could inform development of mitigation plans.
So once I received the model scenario data from NRCan and the Ministry of Transportation, I started to ask myself and others, what is this data really supposed to show? What would someone looking at the data at face value be able to see? So first is the shake map, which is a sample scenario to which you will receive from the Ministry of Transportation and NRCan. And this really paints a high-level snapshot of where the most high impact peak ground accelerations occur. And this is expressed in fractions of gravitational acceleration. It ranges from 0.03 to 0.2 in the 6.8 magnitude earthquake. And once you move to the next tab, this is where you start to see some of the thematic data and accompanying situational awareness data. And this is critical for emergency managers to make informed decisions on everything from where to allocate resources, funding, or staff, right down to rerouting traffic if need be. So the first data layer that's turned on is showing the distribution of critical and non-critical injuries. And right away, you can start making some connections just looking at the distribution of the data across the Metro Vancouver area.
We focus a little bit more on why natural events matter. Of course, the primary impact would be casualties and related liabilities. Everything that supports the material side of life, homes, contents, businesses, all the infrastructure, utilities, public buildings, everything has a financial value and interacts with the financial flows. And of course, the broader scope is the overall economy, which is underpinned by all the material elements that can be impacted by natural disasters. And we are in a unique position to examine the distribution of losses coming from a natural event or from climate risk.
So I'd like to start off with some good news, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, which is the fact that the global financial capital has more than tripled over the last 3 decades. So we actually have roughly 10 times of global GDP of capital available right now in the world. So in a sense, we're awash in capital. There is a lot of finance out there, and the rates of borrowing are near zero and very low. And so I think there's a huge opportunity here for us to figure out how do we shift this low cost capital towards the right kinds of investments. And that's where I think green bonds lend themselves really well to this shifting of capital. So green bonds, for those who aren't familiar, are just regular bonds with an added, I would say the use of proceeds of those green bonds are dedicated to projects that can be defined as green.
The city of Surrey applied for the federal government's Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. And as part of that application process, providing a cost-benefit analysis was highly encouraged and possibly mandatory. So we didn't want to omit that important step to increase our chance of securing the investment. The guidelines were stating in our funding application that we needed to find at least a benefit of 2 times the cost of the project. And it had very little guidance on how to calculate this, but it did allow calculating the benefit over the entire life of the infrastructure that was being funded. And so that was a big clue for how to conduct this, because a lot of times a flood event, we think about it happening just once and trying to calculate the damages from just a single event. But for Surrey, what we'd found with 1 meter of sea level rise, a 200-year event, so an extreme flood event of today, would happen expected about once every 2 years in 80 years time. Our floodplain, we have national, regional, and international railways that crisscross the floodplain, and particularly the national railway has a very high load. So we found a lot of benefit would be realized by the railway sector. Also, there are a lot of residents in the floodplain, so we found life safety to be a big driver in our calculation. And so in the end, we calculated a benefit to cost ratio of 126. And what we thought would just be kind of an exercise just to confirm we were eligible for the funding turned to actually be quite a big driver for building the support to move forwards with the project.
The world's corporations and subnational governments report their climate impacts to their various audiences through a standardized and comparable format, which CDP operates on an annual basis. And fundamentally, the vision here is that in order to manage risk, as was key in the communications around this event, that you have to know what the risks are. And so fundamental to doing that is a process of transparency and disclosure that facilitates insight, thereby enabling responsible risk management. CDP fundamentally is the gold standard for the world's understanding of what is happening and who is making what impacts where. In terms of who our stakeholders are, we represent, we make these requests on the corporate side on behalf of over 560 investors, institutional firms primarily, but also asset owners, underwriters, insurance firms, and pension funds, representing over $106 trillion in assets, as well as on behalf of over 150 corporations that utilize CDP disclosure annually to understand the impacts of their suppliers. and work to decarbonize and manage risk in their supply chains. We collect disclosure annually from over 10,000 companies, over 800 city and county governments around the world, and over 125 states, provinces, and regions.
Having worked in the commercial real estate sector, very familiar with this. The role of education and collaboration between teams is really important. So, the property managers talking to the asset managers, and at the end of the day, it's in situations where this has been successful, where we're able to make the case for those longer term investments, is really around ensuring that everyone, all the stakeholders, are on the same page when it comes to understanding the long-term risk. The hold of the asset as well is a key component. For how long in the portfolio are you expecting to hold a building for? And so is the investment able to kind of match that time horizon as well, is something that comes into play, because at the end of the day, it's the asset managers, and the investors really approving those budgets. So understanding of that risk and really integrating that risk within the climate risk within the overall risk management of the property valuation is something that's really important.
Collectively, we are facing no shortage of challenges in Southwest BC. In addition to social challenges that we can't ignore, like affordability and health challenges, we're up against a wide range of environmental and infrastructure challenges. Our infrastructure and civic facilities are aging in many cases, and we're facing ongoing risk of physical impacts and really cascading consequences of high impact disaster events in the region, with risks like seismic, flood, and other climate change risks. So the reality is that infrastructure comprises what is a complex network of inextricably linked components, which presents a challenge in and of itself. The linkages and the sheer scale of infrastructure make building its resilience a challenge that really demands our collective innovation and collaboration.
The good news, in part, is that Canadian municipalities are required to adopt modern structured asset management systems in Canada. And the core organizing principle of asset management is sustainable service delivery. This means that it doesn't really matter to a local government if it's an engineered or a green asset delivering the service. What matters is whether or not the service is cost effective and reliable. There's growing evidence that this is the case, and that in fact that asset management is almost a made-to-order platform, really, for understanding, valuing, and managing natural assets in ways that preserve their ecological integrity and the services that they provide. And it's precisely this that MNAI, Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, the organization that I'm involved with, helps local governments to do. You can see some of the communities that we have or are working in. The town of Gibsons on the Sunshine Coast was the first mover. We're now working in 20, 30 plus communities. You'll see an announcement in the next week or so. That number is going to jump up quite a bit. The evidence base is very far from exhaustive, but it is getting compelling. Communities are finding that natural assets have high value, that they can be managed using traditional asset management tools, and that they provide services that meet or exceed standards, and of course, provide a host of other benefits.
In the Lower Mainland, we have about 125 kilometers of dikes, so lots of areas like this. But we've also already lost a lot of habitat in this area because of the urbanization and industrial development. 70 to 90% of our coastal wetlands, extremely valuable habitat, extremely important to protect what's left. We ended up talking and kind of working together with another organization in the Lower Mainland, the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, which provides technical support to Indigenous nations in the Lower Fraser. And they were also really interested in thinking about how we could have a slightly different conversation and think about protecting some of this habitat, because they're interested in protecting fish habitat. Prior to that, we ended up having a conversation as well with the city of Surrey, which is mainly on the right side of this image. And they have a neighborhood there that you can see that kind of loops out into the bay called Crescent Beach, which is obviously going to be very vulnerable to any changes in sea level rise. And working with the Deb Harford and the Adaptation to Climate Change team at Simon Fraser University, we had a series of workshops with community members there. And it was really interesting to spend some time with the community members and try to understand what it was that made their community so valuable to them. And then to think about, given what is so valuable to them about being in their community, how would they see the future? I want to share with you a very rough graphic that I tried to make to kind of summarize some reflections on this engagement process and where it took us. So what we really found was, there were these shared values at the center, and then surrounding that are the relationships that we all have as well. And then, there's a bunch of activities that we carry on. And then we have infrastructure, but infrastructure really just kind of is ultimately, when you think about it in this context, it's sort of mediating our relationships with the places that we live. So it is this thin area of mediation. And I made that a dotted line because I just wanted to emphasize that this is, it isn't a barrier, and we can have relationships with nature that go directly out to the places where we are, but that many of our relationships, even with nature and with each other, are sort of, mediated through infrastructure.
I would argue that there are some basic design tenets that I think we should think about and maybe start to implement in practice. One is agility and flexibility. So if infrastructure is moving slowly, the world is moving faster and faster, let's make our infrastructure more agile and flexible instead of rigid. There's a number of ways we can do that in terms of the technologies that are used, adaptive management practices, and so on. Design for complexity. Complexity is the idea that we don't know what our systems do. We can hold a hurricane over New York City and we know bad things will happen, but we don't know precisely what, right? So how we design and plan for surprise is particularly important. We generally don't do that very well. If you're not thinking about information and cybersecurity as you think about infrastructure, then you are quickly making your systems obsolete. So in any thinking about infrastructure going forward, you have to think about information. You have to think about cybersecurity. You have to think about who controls that information, right? Who can make sense of that information? It might be a foreign adversary. It might be the infrastructure operator. It might be an app developer in Silicon Valley, right? It could be all of those. Design for extremes and failure, right? Think about climate change, think about extreme events, and sometimes they get worse in some climate forecasts, sometimes they get better.
Another major driver of disaster risk today is, of course, that the hazards are changing, but also because society and the technology that supports society are also changing. Climate hazards are discussed widely these days, but the major change in society and technology's influence on disaster risk is mentioned somewhat less. I think most people attending today are aware of these changes, but a big part of that change is the networked nature of our modern society. Not only that we have just one type of network, we have multiple interacting and overlaid networks, and multiple types of hazards can cause similar impacts to these networks. So today, addressing disaster risk means addressing risk in networks of networks. And here are some of the things that we can do to address this. One, we should assess and model against multiple extreme hazards to show the wider benefits of reducing risk together. Two, we should look and model with an outward focus when assessing rare events and ask, whose networks can I really depend on? Who is really depending on my networks? And three, we should coordinate investment in networks and restoration plans across sectors and with emergency management and communities for a whole of society risk reduction.
And planning purposes,
as for instance, a land use planner, you're looking at integrating the hazard information with a number of layers of information. So things like, where people live, where people will live in the future, where buildings are located, and layering that information in terms of both the social, the economic, environmental situation. So, and I wanted to clarify those two pieces so that we have a common understanding of what the differences are between the two types of scenarios. When we talk about hazard scenarios, it's about the water. And then we talk about planning scenarios. It's planning and coming up with options for planning how you best want to plan your community in the future.
So local governments in BCs have the authority and responsibility for land use management within our coastal areas. There are these things called the Provincial Flood Hazard Area Land Use Management Guidelines. A couple of years ago, the province put in an amendment to include sea level rise. So when you're doing your flood hazard mapping and modeling, how to consider sea level rise specifically. They've identified two different methods. It's called a combined and a probabilistic method. We use the probabilistic method here in the region. And then we have 4 different relative sea level rise scenarios within the reports, a 0 meter, a 0.5, and a 1 meter and a 2 meter. Those that are familiar with those guidelines, they do state currently, consider a 1 meter sea level rise for the year 2100 for your land use planning activities for that. And so that's really it certainly shaped the data and the outputs and the hazard scenarios to support that land use planning piece.
This project really was spurred from the tsunami warning that we had on January 23rd of 2018, where a 7.9 magnitude earthquake in the Gulf of Alaska triggered a tsunami warning for Vancouver Island. So how did we select the scenarios to be modeled? There's many different scenarios that could trigger a tsunami in our region. So the consultant team included academic experts. They reviewed scientific literature and analysis to select the appropriate tsunami generating sources for modeling. And they worked with emergency programs in our region who had specific events to offer or suggest.
One of the prime motivators for this project was to better understand the risk due to these coastal flood hazards in a holistic way, which could then inform risk reduction and resilience planning for the future. Community resilience refers to the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within a community to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. A resilient community can be thought of as having strengths in 4 areas: natural and built environment, leadership and strategy, human health and well-being, and social, economic, and cultural fabric. For this reason, we felt that a holistic approach to understanding flood risk would help to enhance the community resilience that is part of the cultural fabric of this region. So what we wanted to better understand was the risk to people, culture, governance, environment, and economy, as well as infrastructure in both qualitative and quantitative measures.
Why did we select specific likelihood scenarios for our analysis? The first consideration was to include the regulatory flood, so the 0.5% annual exceedance probability, which is kind of a relatively rare, relatively severe flood scenario, and which is often used for planning purposes. We also wanted to include a flood that has occurred in recent memory, so a milder, more frequent flood. And it is really important to include these frequent small flood events into our hazard assessments and risk assessments, because we have cumulative effects that can add up over time. We also included a more extreme flood, as well as a range of likelihoods. So the key was here to really have this distribution of different likelihoods from frequent to rare events. We all know climate change is occurring and the sea levels are rising. So we also included 4 different sea level rise scenarios, assuming that storm activity, however, stays constant in the future, according to the literature right now. And so we modeled in the end a total of 20 coastal storm flood scenarios using a joint probability approach.
We're also working with 3 communities across each one of the coasts. So in the Pacific region, we're working with Samiamu First Nation. So you heard from Joanne Charles today. And we're generating some new modeling data sets for storm, for tsunamis, a range of different types of tsunamis, and capturing that through the best practices guideline that we're working on. And then in the Arctic region, we're working with the hamlet of Tuktoyaktuk, another community that's facing massive changes to sea level rise, to flooding on a regular basis, and lots of erosion happening at rapid rates. And then on the Atlantic coast, we're working with the region. We're working with the province of New Brunswick and the Acadian Peninsula in New Brunswick. It's a fairly large region, a fairly low-lying region that gets exposed to a number of storms on a regular basis. So trying to capture and working with them to generate new modeling data sets at a regional scale and at a local community scale in a number of communities in the Acadian Peninsula. And then we are working on developing a flood risk modeling tool that can be used across Canada. So we'll be test piloting in each one of these three communities, these three coastal communities. And it's called CanFlood, the application. It's a flood risk modeling tool. And it will combine different damage functions to be able to assess some of the impacts and to flood various types of flooding events. And then, of course, we're working closely with these communities to make sure that the work informs best practices and helps sensibly informs risk reduction strategies and decision makings for adaptation.
Today, we're going to be talking about a Cascadia scenario. So that's a magnitude 9 earthquake. It's kind of the big one that we talk about here in BC, at least. The shaking we expect to last for minutes. For this particular scenario, we expect to see the peak ground acceleration up to about 45% of G. So about half the feeling you feel on a roller coaster when you start to do the free fall. We know that a scenario like this would likely generate a tsunami. We know that there's likely going to be liquefaction and landsliding, and we know that the aftershocks would continue for several years. Once we've kind of constrained what is the earthquake actually, what's the shaking or the hazard from that, then we want to start thinking about the impacts. So we're able to look at lots of indicators. Here's kind of a high level on the left-hand side, that chart there. We can see that the losses from this event are expected to be about $39 billion. We know that there will be over 20,000 buildings that have to be torn down that are unrepairable. We have some really powerful tools to quantitatively look at the risk from different scenarios and from a probabilistic every earthquake that could possibly occur kind of perspective. And really, it's only as useful as the hands that it's put into to the people who know how to take that information and turn it into action.
We know from census data, if you've worked with it, that it covers large regions, but it doesn't really tell us where people live. And so we've defined the extent of, or this group has defined the extent of settled areas. And they provided us with this coverage for all of Canada. And census provides information about the numbers of people and the demographics. And these social vulnerability maps are used to help us understand what the capacities of different neighborhoods are to withstand and recover from events. And mostly, though, the human settlement layer is about defining the built environment and the vulnerabilities of that built environment. So it starts with an inventory of the types of buildings that are on the ground for different land uses, and that eventually ends up with a set of indicators that track the numbers and types of buildings, the numbers of people that are in those buildings, and what capital assets are exposed to loss. So this is what the risk profile looks like. The exposure part of the risk profile looks like for City X. This is the land use map, and I'll draw your attention to the legend in the top left. You'll see that the land uses are broken down into kind of the conventional residential and commercial land uses. So we have low density, medium density, and high density residential uses, a mixed class, which is residential and commercial industrial, and then a commercial industrial class.
We've come together and we've created a process where we can understand what risk-informed planning is and how it would happen in the real world. And this is something that, we could be undertaking and we could be mainstreaming in a lot of the processes that we already do as part of planning our communities. So it was really interesting to see some of the ideas and recommendations that came out of the group. A lot of the sort of themes or sort of similar pieces that I see coming through One is definitely around buildings and focusing on the building stock within the community and trying to address the ones that are the greatest risk to the community at large, but also focusing on certain segments of the community that may be more vulnerable and may be exposed to more vulnerability and risk by accident. So we may not actually know about these things, and there seems to be a thread around that. There's also a big point around engagement with other stakeholders. So as someone who, wants this information to be taken up into these processes, that's a really interesting challenge, because how do you then, translate this information not just to the planning community and the planners that are leading these processes, but also all the rest of the groups that are working alongside them to do this really important work. And another one is obviously the investment piece and finding the funds to do this stuff once we figure out what the actions are that we want to take in a particular city or context.
There are systems and capabilities already in place that can help us make this vision a reality. So just think about, for example, we routinely use our cell phones to access integrated global and national weather models to answer simple questions like to plan expeditions over multi-days or to plan a flight path into different parts of the country. These are incredibly complex and integrated models that we routinely use every day. And we access massive online geospatial data sets on our smartphones to help us make sense of the world around us and to help navigate pathways in the backcountry through dense urban landscapes. And these applications are making use of very sophisticated algorithms to help us chart the most effective routes to where we want to go.
What we're looking at here is pretty much what we could probably find in the New York Times. We have our current cases, we have a number of people who have died due to COVID, mobility in our current index. But ThoughtSpot also lets us get down to a more granular level. Here's at a daily basis. Looks like people in the States rest on Sundays and slowly move until Fridays, and they have their peak movement. And when it comes to actually testing, we see that our testing cases move up and down as well with the week. And this starts becoming kind of interesting, but it's still answering questions that somebody else asked. What if I want to know what's happening in my county? This level of data doesn't support a detailed, fine level view. But if I go to my search bar, I can look at new cases, and let's look at it by county. And I can create the map myself.
So as you know, Open Maps right now is our public face. When we launch to geo.ca, that will become a sister website to complement the Open Government website, but really be more specific to the geospatial community and more attractive than our Open Maps site. So right now we have about 3,500 data sets. That's a lot. And that's from about 20 departments and agencies and 3 provinces. And we're onboarding. Our goal is to onboard all of the provinces in the next 2 years. We're supporting Treasury Board, who's also looking not from a geos perspective, but from an all data perspective, doing the same thing, onboarding provincial and territorial data into their platform. And by onboarding, I mean making it discoverable as a point where the public or companies, organizations can more easily find open data. And as I mentioned, we're supporting the whole cumulative effects impact assessment regime by enabling geospatial data that's specific to that topic to feed an open science and data platform. And we're also an implementation of the Open Government Action Plan. We contribute highly to that. One of the elements that we've been looking at is assessing data quality that I'm sure is of interest to a lot of folks, and working with our central agencies so that federally we can give our users a bit of sense of the level of quality of the data that they're looking at. And so you can check out the Open Government Action Plan, the last one from 2018 to 2020, to see what kind of progress we've made on that.
A system has to do something really, really well, right? And if you start thinking about a hamburger, you can add all kinds of stuff to a hamburger, right? When does it no longer become a hamburger, right? Or what are the essential components of a hamburger that makes it a hamburger, right? So clearly, if you don't have a hamburger in the middle, you don't have a hamburger. So I know this sounds kind of stupid, but it's like, this is what it means. That we got to focus on the thing that this is going to do. And, we can go down rabbit holes. And I think this happens to a lot of projects. And a lot of projects we get brought into is like, there's a laundry list of requirements. There's 100 things or 200 things, 300 things it has to do. And you can go down a massive rabbit hole of, we need this function and that button and this, blah, blah, blah. Spend years and years and years doing that and then end up literally with nothing. As opposed to, hey, let's focus on key functions and let's nail those. So this whole idea that, less is more. They're really, really hone in on that. So, what makes a hamburger a hamburger? Well, it's a hamburger. Or what makes Uber Uber, right? Is like, well, Uber is no longer Uber if you can't get someone to pick you up.
The effort has generally been fostering this all of society collaboration to implement Sendai and build resilience in Southwest BC. What does all of society really mean? For us, it's meant connecting a diversity of voices and types of knowledge across cultures, disciplines, the public, private, and NGO sectors, as well as across hazards, the different natural hazards that especially we face here in Southwest BC. The all of society approach sounds really nice, but it's often, I guess, underestimated in terms of the time and energy and investment that goes into fostering that. So that's a big part of what we try to do. The value of dialogue, I think, is often underestimated, but a critical part of this effort in terms of reducing risk and building resilience.
Hatsqualtanoya, Siam, Siyoyokwa. Si Talkton, Kwashaman Snot, the Skahotmish Okamilk. Just opening in the Skahotmish, the Squamish language, saying it's great to see each and every one of you, respected leaders, honored guests, friends, and relatives. My ancestral name is Si Talkton. I am one of 16 elected council members of the Squamish Nation. And it's just an honor to be here. And on behalf of my people, the great nation of Squamish Nation and our council, want to formally welcome you to this virtual event. Our homelands and our territories are laden with mythology, with place names that remind us of our resilience. They remind us of what has happened and how the landscape has transformed over time. And those stories and those place names remind us of who we are and where we come from, but also how we should conduct ourselves as human beings in that natural space, in that natural place. What's really interesting about all of these origin stories that we have as Squamish people and many Indigenous people have is they all have the same lesson. It's that for some reason, we as humans fell out of the natural rhythm of the world. We forgot our teachings, as our elders would tell us. And as a result of not listening to the people that have the gifts to tell us what's going to happen, that maybe we get greedy and we start taking too much fish, or we start abusing kind of our relationship with the natural world. All of these things happen. And then there's a serious consequence to the people as a result of that. So our elders, when you're a little child, they'll tell you stories about places and kind of what the Squamish people went through, going through. But for the purpose of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about the flood, which was one of the major catalysts of origin and repopulation, and talks a lot about resilience as it pertains to Inchikai, which many people know as Mount Garibaldi. The Squamish people know it as Inchikai, which means, if we translate that into Squamish, it means the dirty place, because of all the glacial till that comes off the mountain and dirties the waters and the creeks that come off Inchikai or Mount Garibaldi. So the elders always tell us that our history is like a wave. It's like you're out in a canoe and you're going through the tidal rollers and you're going up and you're going down and you're going up. So when times are good, you're going up. And then you hit this precipice and then all of a sudden you start going down. So the question as leaders that we always have to our spiritual people and to our elders is, where are we on the wave? And it's interesting because people will provide us different thoughts. Because some of them will want to say, well, we're down here, we got to get back up here. And some people will think we're on the upswing. And that's kind of the reconciliation we have as Scotish people, to kind of go back to that story of the flood and say, are we listening to our elders? Are we listening to the gifts? Are we holding on to the gifts that we were given, and listening and treating each other with humbleness and kindness, and respecting all of those teachings that have been given to us on how to interact with the natural world?
Thank you so much for helping us start in a good way, Setoctin. We're thankful for being connected to the Squamish Nation and the other nations that we've been thinking about and hearing from throughout the Understanding Risk series. We know that building resilience is truly something that has to happen in a collaborative way. And we do that by engaging with the people who have been stewards of this land since time immemorial, and engaging across sectors so that we can do this in a way that is both building on the strengths of the past and a sense of what the shared future can look like. So thank you. So today we have a wonderful opportunity to reflect on all that we've accomplished over the past number of months, over 20 sessions. It's an exceptional community, truly, of planners, engineers, policymakers, researchers, students, citizens, artists, and more coming together. And we offered over the length of the URBC effort, summer webinars, 2 launch events at the beginning of September and November, some workshops that focused on initiatives that are going on in our region right now, and thinking about how can the community learn about and catapult forward. We did dialogue panels where we heard from expert voices around the continent. We are doing today's report back and celebration. URBC has been active on social media, and we are offering the results of URBC through providing videos and slides that you can use in an ongoing way.
Thank you, Susanna. For those who've been with us on this journey, you'll know that we've been asking this question: how do we implement the Sendai framework on the ground? But really, this question is what Setoctin just asked us to consider. It's really, how do we live in harmony with a landscape that is dynamic, that changes without notice? And we've grounded our conversations in the Sendai framework, which is an international framework with 7 goals and targets to help guide us toward a more resilient future. And I'm just going to take 1 minute of our time, or maybe 1.5 minutes of our time. You may wonder why we've been using the circle diagram. And for us, this is a reflection of so many things, but it's a reflection of design thinking and how to bring our knowledge to decision makers.
We've developed actionable strategies through the past symposiums, and as I outlined in the opening, reflecting going into 2020, I was very heartened in terms of how many of these actions have moved forward, despite the lack of a formal risk governance mechanism. So very heartening to see that these things do get done. I guess the hope is that they could just get done faster, be accelerated through enhanced collaboration. And I think with regards to the relative risk that we face, there is some urgency. The disaster risk that we have in Southwest BC is quite real, quite large, and does require, I think, this sustained effort over time. These actionable strategies are aligned with Sendai and many other government reports at all levels, from the City of Vancouver Resilience Strategy to the BC Auditor General's Climate Risk Report and the Pan-Canadian Framework at the national level, and specifically the resilience elements included therein. This year's symposium has been quite a feat. We had one in-person kickoff workshop in February, which seems like a lifetime ago at this point. And the value of that in-person workshop is not to be underestimated. And it's a key part of how we develop the program for Understanding Risk Symposiums. We use a bottom-up approach by getting the community together to capture what the key themes and areas to focus on for that specific year are. And this year we had a number of these initiative and focus sessions that were offered, as you'll hear through today's session. We hosted 20 online events with almost 40 hours of programming, 12 initiative and focus sessions, 4 dialogue sessions. We had 238 registrations with over 1,000 attendances from across Canada, Italy, Germany, the USA, and elsewhere. We had 6 organizing committee members, 20 session conveners, 60 contributors, and 19 volunteers. So in essence, a small army of people working to bring this to you.
We've been doing all of this work to get us to greater, as you identified in your chats, greater collaboration and greater hope and connections and understanding of the initiatives and possibility to do things together that we can't do alone. Up on the screen, you'll see here the picture of a few of 2 of our 4 dialogue panels. These were keynote panel style keynote panels, but done in a URBC style, that we're allocated a lot of time for Q&A and discussion amongst the panelists and a little less of the upfront presentation. We had local and international thought and action leaders participating. And the key themes derived from past URBC interests and inputs of the community, and the workshop we held in person to kick off in February 2020 helped to define which topics we would be exploring. So the 2 that you're seeing here, in September, we looked at low carbon resilient buildings, moderated by George Benson of the Vancouver Economic Commission, thinking about what have we learned about creating low carbon resilient buildings from an academic and practitioner perspective. Later in the month, we had a session on Beyond Death, Dollars, and Downtime, looking at functional recovery in BC, moderated by Micah Hilt from the City of Vancouver. And here, practitioners and seismologists and engineers got together and thinking about what does it actually look like to ensure we do achieve functional recovery. In November, our 2 dialogue sessions, the first focused on finance and focus. This was moderated by Puninda Tind, who helped us have a conversation about incentivizing investment in risk reduction and adaptation. And we had practitioners working both in the public sector and private sector thinking about what it looks like to advance investments. And then lastly, and on November 10th, we had a dialogue about resilient infrastructure in the age of the Anthropocene. And this was moderated by Christy McConnell from Macdonald. And here we talked about various kinds of resilient infrastructure, blue-green infrastructure, traditional infrastructure, security infrastructure, and thinking about what that actually looks like to ensure we are resilient to disasters in the future. So an incredible array of content that we have covered over the past few months. We are now going to think about some reflections. What stands out about how these pieces of URBC connect together? And when we think about planning for a resilient future, what would it look like to build on all of that has been covered and orient ourselves towards a more desirable, resilient future? So that is our focus over the next little bit. And our first speaker to share her reflections is Johanna Wagstaff from CBC News.
Thank you so much. First of all, it's just an honor and a pleasure to be speaking to all of you. This is sort of like the Coachella of disaster mitigation and risk management for me as somebody who works in the media. As a scientist, you know, my day job is sort of talking about disasters as they unfold. And so as a scientist, I think a big takeaway for me listening to the sessions and speakers is truly how much work is being done on this that so many people don't know about. How many people are thinking about multi-level hazard risk reduction? How many tools are being worked on and being shared across agencies and expertise? And it is not only inspiring, but almost overwhelming how many people are thinking about this right now. And I think sometimes the newsroom can get caught up in accountability and chasing sirens, as we say in the newsroom. But such a nice reminder to me that information and education is a huge part of what we do, especially as a public broadcaster. And I think that's so important for me to be able to be a collaborator between agencies and between our audience, and a reminder that our audience has an appetite for this. They want to know what's happening behind the scenes, and if I can help share your stories or help educate or help get that information out, it would be my pleasure to continue to work with all of you. So as far as next steps, I think we should be doing more of this.
We largely exist today as separated points, too often further separated by the silos of our respective sectors, disciplines, and perspectives. But I think this vantage point also highlights what makes this amazing collaborative coalition and this event so remarkable. So while there are a number of standout reasons for time constraints, I'll just highlight three. First, the unwavering humility and inspiring diversity of this exceptional community. Just as a for instance, in a single day, I was able to participate in conversations around how to shift financial models, financial paradigms beyond status quo cost benefit to embodied reconnection to holistic health through Indigenous brilliance, including a movement session to Tribe Called Red's Electric Powwow. Second, enabling and empowering our collective intelligence and our collaborative agency. Again, not just across discipline sectors and I'm learning today even countries, but also different ways of knowing and being and how these shift our collective purpose in relation. And in so doing, making the invisible visible. So from the Terra Cognita session this morning to intersections and interrelationships and new potentials now revealed so that we can better work together to realize them. Potawatomi botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer, who I'm madly in love with, reminds us that all flourishing is mutual and that Mother Nature's gifts multiply by our care and dwindle with our neglect. We are all bound in a covenant of reciprocity and a pact of mutual responsibility to sustain those who sustain us. And whatever our gifts, we're called to give them and to dance for the renewal of the world in return for this privilege of breath. So building on Murray's call for active hope, I ask us to carry forward. What is our role, not just in resilience, but in mutual flourishing? And what is the bravest thing we can do to equitably empower it?
Thank you so much for having me. I just wanted to first thank the organizer of this event. The more I learn about it, I feel like I understand how much I don't know about it actually, because there is a really multidimensional and complex thing. And I myself recently moved to Vancouver last year to start my PhD. And it was a great opportunity for me to learn and become aware of all ongoing efforts in regional resilience, considering different disasters in the region. And my background is in engineering and seismic resilience, and I'm working on Cascadia subduction zone magnitude 9 earthquake event. And the fact to see more people from different sectors are thinking about the potential impacts and making plans to improve preparedness is fantastic. And I think it's a great opportunity. One of the great things I think I obtained from this event was to know right now whom I can reach out if I have any question or if I want to discuss something about these issues and my research or in the future. And I feel like building a regional resilience is definitely a complex task and require good communication between people involved in this field, including risk modelers, engineers, social scientists, and planners. And even though people may have different differences in understanding risks, but I think we all, like I myself as a researcher, student, or people from different sectors, we all need to be on the same page in terms of actions to take to enhance resilience in our communities. And no one, I think, by itself can be successful alone to build regional resilience. And definitely, as also mentioned previously, more discussion and collaboration is needed. And I look forward to get involved in more events and more discussions about that. And thanks again for having me on this conversation.
You were so good. We had a seismic shift right here in my studio. I just want to talk about how cool you all are. You are amazing. The expertise you bring to all this. You, my friends, are the unsung heroes because your very jobs, what you do is fraught with peril and hazard and incredibly high risk. And you know why? Because if you do everything right, nobody's going to know about it. But if you make one mistake, it is literally a disaster. You are front page news. So I just have to give you a big high five. That's 5 right there. If I'm going to give you a high 10, this is a high 10. I don't know if that's even a thing.
So the things that are giving us hope, the action ideas that we'd like to invest in more, this collaboration, the DR Hub, sharing, and seem like some of our most important pieces in terms of the things that are giving us future. I think connection with Indigenous knowledge and our Indigenous community is also something that is helping to drive us. And then lots of other pieces here for consideration, thinking about the involvement of banks and the insurance industry, calling for more of that involvement, making sure that we are really investing in partnerships and optimistic, connecting with our optimistic colleagues, open data, open science, sharing our knowledge, having a whole of society approach, thinking about our community, having really the diversity of perspective stands out quite a bit. Starting to identify some standards. Family is coming out. That is probably giving us hope. The openness, again, standing up, out interoperability, thinking about the fact that there is continued interest. We are mutually flourishing. We are advancing the work together. These are all pieces that are standing out here in terms of where we're headed and what would give us hope as we go forward.
This has been quite a conversation that's been going on for 3 months, and I would say that it, given the situation with the pandemic and the fact that we've moved this discussion to a virtual setting, has been advantageous because I feel like we've been able to build the momentum, and it's been kind of like a crescendo of increasing impact over the 7 or 8 or 10 conversations that we've had since August. And some of the key themes that have emerged, I'm going to speak about decision-making and collaboration, relationships with local government, information and data, and finally, kind of building code and regulatory lever related observations.
What stood out the most to me is the diversity of uses of hazard and risk information and the enthusiastic participation of so many different user groups. So through my research, we ran an in-person session a year ago with some engineers, planners, and emergency managers, and they were super enthusiastic and happy to have a space to collaborate and debate and discuss. And I'm really encouraged to see that this enthusiasm exists at a much larger scale, even virtually. There can and should be many opportunities going forward to continue this knowledge transfer and communication among stakeholders. So it's promising. As someone on the research and academic side of things, of course, of primary importance to me is to make sure our, shaking, landslide, and liquefaction maps are detailed and accurate. But complementary to this is ensuring that they're actually useful for the intended audiences. So it's important to continue to provide these opportunities for colleagues, especially on the application side, like planners, emergency managers, and policymakers. This opportunity to learn about the emerging science, current projects in the region that affect their work, and to keep everybody updated. I'm really encouraged by this collaboration. I believe that additional training on how to use and implement some of these new platforms and applications, like Risk Profiler that we were introduced to today, is a really important next step. In the same way that I hope that our seismic hazard information is implemented in the future, I hope that these new platforms and applications, which are obviously the fruit of a lot of labor, are widely used in mitigating risk and building overall resilience in Metro Van and beyond. So let's keep all these connections fresh. It's really encouraging for a young professional to see this in an industry, and I'm excited to get into it. And yeah, I hope that continues, and I hope that this sort of collaboration will truly help to build resilience sooner than later.
My thoughts that I'm going to share with you today, I'm just going to take a few minutes to do that, really reflect what many others have already said. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that really means that we as a community are coming toward a shared understanding of risk and what it means to be on a path together toward a more resilient future. We, over the years, have been shifting our focus from understanding, impacts and consequences to thinking about functional recovery. At the opening session, Laurie Johnson shared lessons from California, what it means to live with catastrophic earthquakes and now a changing climate. And she reminded us that resilience is a collective action. It's a process that begins with a shared understanding and acknowledgement of what's at stake. And it unfolds through a mix of what she called bottom-up and top-down initiatives that come together at critical moments of transformation. And I'd like to think that we're here today at one of those moments of transformation. We've grounded ourselves in Sendai. We've looked at how it fits into other international agreements and what we can do here on the ground. And we've thought about where that could take us in the future. We've considered this question: what does it take for us to incorporate disaster resilience into mainstream planning and decision-making? We identified the challenges. We know that people are more receptive to these ideas, but we also are very mindful that these risk trends are outpacing our capabilities to manage. We've thought about solutions and opportunities, and I wanted to share with you a little bit of what we've learned from the community from the beginning. In terms of understanding risk, Fiona reminded us that we fear more what we don't know than what we do know, and that often people can be overwhelmed when presented with risk information that asks them to wrestle with complexity and uncertainty about hazards that impact their lives and livelihood. But that we have opportunities to engage people in conversations to really help them think about their future. Many working in the engineering realm, John being one of them, has reminded us about the challenge that we face with current codes. While they do a great job for life safety, they don't cover existing buildings or what happens to those buildings after a disaster. But also has reminded us that we have opportunities to retrofit buildings that are safer and maybe even more robust than current buildings. We've had many people from across jurisdictions remind us that governments are part of the puzzle, but that there are limits to what governments can do, and that there are opportunities for us to build on the capacities that exist at the neighborhood level. We've brought a lens to social equity, thinking about who bears the burden of risk and recognizing that this is an important issue for us. And we've identified ways in which we can start to address that. And we've hosted URBC now for 3 years to bring deliberative dialogue squarely into the work that we do. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Susanna and Jessica for holding space for us to have this conversation, which is so important. And so as we think about the science policy integration challenge, yes, Sendai provides a high-level framing. But what it means to actually bring this down to the ground is to not think about risk as a static measure anymore, but rather to think about it as a dynamic and fluid consequence of choices that we've made that have led us up to this point in time and that will carry us into the future. And so I think the time is now. I think the challenges for us now are to start thinking about benchmarks, where we want to be, what we can actually do together to reduce risk, to start setting those targets. And I guess my call to action is, I think it's time that we act now to establish this work as a collaborative, place-based model of network governance that builds on all of our strengths moving forward. And so with that, I just wanted to say that I hope that this is our moment of transformation. And I wish us all the best and look forward to crossing with you down the road. And I wanted to remind us also that we're just part of a global initiative. As we finish our symposium here, we're passing the torch to the Global 2020 Understanding Risk Forum, which starts next week, with a powerhouse program of initiatives that in some ways mirror what we're doing here in a very small way in this region, but that remind us that solutions are being brought to the table every day. And I encourage you all to be part of that. And with that, I'll pass back to Susanna. Thank you.
And thank you, Murray, for that beautiful summary of where we've been and the importance of doing this together.
Thanks, Susanna. As you'll see on this slide, there are too many names here to read each one, but just a huge thank you to all of our sponsors who we've thanked a number of times, the core sponsors and additional sponsors who without their support, this wouldn't be possible. And not just possible, but we've always tried to keep the barrier to registration low, again, in harmony with the UR Global Forum. It's a main point in terms of encouraging that all of society engagement. Our organizing committee, you can see a few of their faces. I have a few of their faces here in front of me now. Susanna, Sahar, Murray, Daryl, Mike. It's always a challenge to pull together an organizing committee for these symposiums, but this year with COVID related challenges and a number of kind of false starts, it's just been amazing to have this all come together and would not be possible without this team that you see here. Our session conveners and moderators, everybody who took on that leadership role to put together a session. It's a huge undertaking that you might not appreciate until you do it yourself. So huge kudos to them. And all of our contributors, speakers, artists, storytellers, musicians. Huge shout out and thank you to everybody. The volunteers as well, the small army of volunteers who helped from everything with note-taking, from everything from note-taking to graphic recording to help with the website. Again, not possible without the support of these people.
I'm just going to say a few things that really stood out just listening in on these amazing conversations. What I really heard was that, if you look at this, you'll see things that are on a very personal, local level and just like an individual level. And then you'll see things that are on much more of a macro level. And it's clear that all of these things need to happen in concert. And so really thinking about social equity and then also thinking about things like consistency and guidelines. So really all of everyone just coming together in a meaningful way from where you're at. And just to echo what Chris said this morning, just that our homelands are laden with mythology that reminds us of our resilience. So that's a good reminder for everyone of what we're working towards and a way to connect back to the land. Gerald, do you want to go to the next one? So this one is just about, what people are saying about what they valued. And I just want to really echo back, the community is so important here. People really need to get together. This is what I heard from multiple people. And there's just a thirst to connect and share knowledge, hear about what's been happening lately and who's who out there, who's up to what, and just getting more people involved and more ideas. And also just the knowledge and sharing that in a timely way and growing a network of practitioners. So you kind of have a sense of who's out there, knowing that you're not alone. And also sharing the science back in bite-sized chunks and keeping that momentum up because that is so important and just helping to keep each other motivated. And people said that they really saw the progress since 2017. So that's pretty amazing.
Hey,